Townhall. I'm Victoria Andrews, and I'm a regional minister here in Pacific Mountain Region. I resource northern BC, the Yukon, and Lower Mainland East at the moment, and doing some extra duties on behalf of Trina for this month. My colleague Kathy Davies was doing that last month. It's a shared endeavor, but we have come together in our regular time, and I'm going to hand things over to Deborah, our wonderful president.
Thank you, Victoria, and welcome everyone to our town hall for March. And it is wonderful to be here with you. And I'm glad that you're able to join us today. We do have a number of things that we want to do today with you, and most particularly to be able to welcome Reverend Tony Snow to our gathering today. So I'm going to start off with prayer and then introduce Tony and then ask him to follow through after that with his welcome and his presentation. Unfortunately, I will have to leave somewhere around 1:30 just because of another commitment that I couldn't get out of today to be here for the full time, but I hope that you understand that. So welcome and thank you so much. Let us pray. Let us receive the gift of today and center ourselves. We gather from different situations, Holy One, and from different places along life's journey, but we are glad to be here. We come together with different expectations of this gathering, but with a common desire to service our communities to the best of our abilities. On this International Women's Day, we pray for women across the world. We remember, celebrate, and uplift the wisdom in the stories of Indigenous women in our society. We celebrate the contribution of all women to the life of our communities. We celebrate those who advocate for progress on gender equality. There is still so much to do to support women in our local communities and all over the world, to overcome barriers of prejudice and discrimination, and to break through structures that hold them back. We thank you for the many examples of women throughout the history who have been courageous in their witness as your disciples. Bless us in this time together to hear what you are calling us to do, to hear the good work and the good news that is going on in our region, knowing that you walk beside us always. Amen. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome Reverend Tony Snow as the Indigenous Minister for Chinook Winds. And he is graciously also filling in with PMRC while Reverend John Snow is on leave. And some of you already know Tony and have participated in some of his online sessions. He's a member of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. He grew up on Treaty 7 land at Morley in Alberta. And the focus of Tony's work is to connect the communities of faith and Indigenous peoples throughout the regions, and to bring reconciliation awareness and healing through ceremonies and worship, as well as other events and workshops held in person and online. Tony also works in the area of environmental protection and traditional land use planning, and has served on the For the Love of Creation Committee. So that's the National Interdenominational Climate Justice Campaign, the Climate Advisory Circle for the United Church of Canada, and CANRAC Canada, which supports climate action as a network. And I'm going to turn control over to Tony and ask Tony to do our land acknowledgement and to do our presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us, Tony.
Thank you so much. If I could get a co-host duties, then I can share screen, which would be helpful. Thank you so much for this invitation to come and speak on a number of issues, but for the work that I'm doing currently for Lent, it is the 40 days of reconciliation that we're working toward. Some exploration of where we are at and some initiation into the dialogue through 7 blanket exercises done at different churches. And so we're continuing to work in ways that hopefully open up a dialogue for people and help them to take on some ownership of the reconciliation work that they are fully capable in and really want to be involved in. So as we knew, I'm just going to share this screen. As we begin, we generally begin with prayer and a recognition of where we are at. So I'm going to do that as a start to our gathering here. I burn the smudge, which is a gathering of medicinal herbs and plants from our traditional territory in the mountains here near Banff, and how that gives us a proper grounding, building on the traditions of our ancestors and how they practiced prior to the coming of the settler and the missionary, and how we had our practice and knew God in this way. And so the smudge that we do is a cleansing and purification. It is something that our elders do every day. It is the purification and communion with God. The smoke from the smudge takes our prayers to the Creator. And so we offer a prayer. Jesus Christ, when chapter chasing the Jagawaka, Wahogu Harichin, Narizi Narigi Chavichin, Nagahaz Naguchet Ichias. Amen. We also offer a candle for the experience of a genocide in Canada and of a remembrance of those who lost their lives as children, as loved ones, as parents and grandparents who struggled throughout their life to live in accord with the rules and strictures that they came upon and that imposed themselves upon their life, their belief, their spirituality, and their heritage. As we share today, it's going to offer some time for people to ask questions. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. Our International Women's Day, as we've heard, an important role in our communities, the role of women. There was a balance between the genders and the sexes and those of gender diversity as well. We knew of Two-Spirit people. We knew of the power of women. And in many of our societies, we were matriarchal in our orientation and in our governance, so that the women were in control of our housing. They were in control of leadership. They were in control of the education of the young ones and the carrying on of our traditions. And so always a reminder that since the time of patriarchy, there's been an undue balance in our nations. For our land acknowledgement, I just want to share, this is the lands that I come from. This mountain is called Iamnathka, and that it describes the sheer cliff, the structure of it. And this is the place within our land where God sits. This is the place where we recognize where it is, where we commune with God. We don't climb this mountain recreationally It is found just outside the boundary of our reserve, so we have no access to it, and it is open freely for people to go climbing on. So, but we would never do that. We would only use it for if you're going for a vision quest, if you're going for a particular calling to commune with God in that way. Minnewanka is another holy lake. Mine means water, Wanka means God or spirit. And this lake is a holy lake, and it's a place where people go for a vision quest, for communion with the spirit and understanding of their role and place in creation. And now it sits in the Banff Park area, so it is off limits to us and for our ceremonies and things like that. And so we live with that understanding. Mnehruwin, which is the Caven Basin in Banff. Caven Basin is a ceremonial area, and it was the first finding from the Canada Rail, CP Rail groups that saw this build this structure, and it was taken on by Canada, Dominion of Canada, in the 1880s, and named the first national park in Canada. And so at that point, we were restricted from access to it and was turned into a tourist zone. Yarhetatanga is the name of this mountain, and to us it looks like a buffalo lying on its side. And they call it Tunnel Mountain because the person who didn't get a chance to blow tunnels through the Rogers Pass wanted to blow a hole through this mountain. And this mountain to us is a sacred mountain that looks after the waters, the plants, and the medicines in this area. So it's a very critical part of the area. And right here you see is the town of Banff. Ihage Nakota is another significant site. In the story, an individual wanted to be within this land forever and was turned into this mountain. And you see in the background there, the town of Canmore. Ozada Imne is the Kananaskis Lakes area where they did some of the Olympics in 1988. This was a place of refuge and a place of where leaders would go to contemplate. And so our land acknowledgement. It is said by our Lakota ancestors that the elderly ones so loved the land that they chose to walk barefoot and to feel real soil under their feet. And they felt that the land was life-giving, that it surrounded their footsteps with the blessing of energy and purpose. It is understood by our ancestors that the living waters had a spirit, that the land itself had a soul. In the land acknowledgement, we hear words like work, live, and play. We do not hear words like displacement or forced relocation or incarcerated for venturing outside the reserve boundaries. To an Indigenous ear, the land acknowledgement is an acknowledgement of loss, an acknowledgement of relationships and ruin, and the need for repair. To an Indigenous ear, they say there is room for rehabilitation and repair. There is room for justice. An equality of space that recognizes the needs of all, including the newcomer and the displaced from other lands. As we seek to live out our calls to action, calls to justice, and calls to the church, may we heed humility and deep understanding for the world we inherited and the world we want to see. Here, a quote from my grandfather, Chief Walking Buffalo from the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. Hills are always more beautiful than stone buildings, you know. Living in a city is an artificial existence. Lots of people hardly ever feel real soil under their feet, see plants grow except in flower pots, or get far enough beyond the street light to catch the enchantment of the night sky studded with stars. When people live far from the scenes of the Great Spirit's making, it's easy for them to forget his laws. And finally, this connection to our belief system comes down to this proverb that I have been sharing in a number of different venues for this time of reconciliation. And it says, I have come to earth to care for the other. Without caring, all my dreams are dust. And this is an old saying from our elders that talks about the generosity of spirit and sharing and working together in common communion with creation and with those gifts among us, that we are able to help facilitate an ongoing stewardship of the land and of each other, of relationship and kinship that we can grow from. In this idea of reconciliation, and I'll just jump right into this, and I'll try to make this short so that we have more time for questions. Here I've created a timeline, and there's several timelines that I've created around Indigenous work and the work of the United Church. So in 1960, we had development of UCC and Indigenous relations engaged. From that example, we have in the Anglican Church the book called Beyond Traplines. And that book identified that there was a need for the church, the Anglican Church, to begin understanding its impact on the nations that it was involved with and how to move forward. And it did this by engaging with the communities themselves and getting a First Nation perspective, so that we had a number of presentations on that book and about the effects of ministry within these communities that began a dialogue. And so in 1970 is when we had in Morley the inception of the ecumenical conference that brought together spiritual leaders, Native spiritual leaders, and Indigenous people. The United Church was there, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church. A number of different bodies came together to talk to Native spiritualists, holy men and holy women, and those that practice their traditional ways, in order to understand and start demystifying some of that, so they would stop condemning and stop leading our other community members against their traditional people. In 1986, we have from the recently passed Alberta Billy from the Webekai First Nation, the first apology that was demanded and then delivered in 1986. An apology was for colonialism. 1998, the second apology by the Very Reverend Bill Phipps for the residential schools. And in that direct apology and implication of the church, we began to see the stirrings of the class action suit by Phil Fontaine and the AFN, and the work that was done to bring that suit to resolution. And so in that time, we have in the United Church the developing of the anti-racist policy that was adopted, the affirming congregations program that was endorsed. So there was this shift happening around how we were learning to accept and honor those from different backgrounds, those from different understandings. And so 2006 is when we had the intercultural church commitment brought forward. In 2008, as I said, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was signed by the United Church and many other churches. Not all of the Catholic Church had signed on. There were 3 parties that did sign on in Quebec and Ontario, but none to represent the overarching church in its work, and that was brought up in the TRC. So in 2009, the United Church, we had a commitment to inclusion, and an intercultural vision was adopted. 2012. The work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was completed, and the recommendations were adopted by the United Church in 2015. 2016, we have the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People adopted. 2017, 2018, the calls were to the church from the caretakers of the Indigenous Circle, the elders from the United Church Indigenous community were put forward the calls to the church as a document on how Indigenous people would belong to the United Church. And so that was approved in 2017, I think it's 2018. And we could continue to see the implications of that and the beginnings of a implementation through the last General Council, where the Indigenous Church was fully formed. In 2020, the Anti-Racist Denomination Declaration and Commitment was put forward in October of that year. And so we continue to work along this trajectory of Indigenous and racial reconciliation and work toward some balance between where we have been and where we are today. There's a bit of a context here that I've drawn from this history. And for the Stoney people, really began in the 1800s, 1850s. We had the first conversions. We had the first missionaries coming out in the 1840s with the Reverend Robert Rundle to our area. Then the work of the development of the first church in the 1870s, and then the work of the missionaries to act as agents of the government in the signing of the treaties. So we had the first Treaty 7 treaty here in 1877, and as we see in 1876, there was already put in place an Indian Act to curtail the rights before they had even signed a treaty with our area and other areas that came after us, like Treaty 8. And then we start to see the residential school era, which began really with the missionaries to our area being sent children being sent to the mission church to be educated. And after a while, that turned into more of a cash cow for the missionaries who wrote to Ottawa needing money to build a school, and then an orphanage. And they claimed that the kids were orphans, but there were no orphans, as my dad writes in his book. And so this capitalization on that beginning a relationship then turned into sort of a dogmatic, stringent effect of the residential school system as it was imposed throughout the country, with assimilation policies and abuses that occurred in Morley, as well as some of the schools that the Stoney children were sent to, like the Red Deer Industrial School, which was one of the worst, most deadly schools in Canada. And so we start to see a parallel in the findings at the Port Alberni School as well in this past 2 weeks ago. So there's ongoing work and ongoing ways that we have started to deal with that past. But on the other side of that, starting to look at where Indigenous people and the Indigenous church, the Indigenous theology has started to spread from. And so now we're thinking about that implication of Vatican II. There was a line from Beloved Amazonia from Pope Francis talking about what that history might have looked like had we fully implemented what Vatican II was saying, and trying to bring a balance between Indigenous ideas and understandings and into a church that could open its doors and really be fully embracing a different way of being to one another. And so that becomes an interesting sort of counterpoint to the work that was done after that. So the Ecumenical Conference, as I mentioned, 1970 to 1985. And then we start to see the first apology. We start to see these class action suits. We start to see agreements happening, and then these resolutions that we are faced with today. Again, a similar type of approach. This to me was an important reminder that when we had for the Indigenous Month, we had an Indian Day of Prayer that was put forward by the elders of the Ecumenical Conference. And that was the first thing that they did. And they set June 21st as that day. And it was observed by the United Church, it was observed by the Anglican Church, and continued to be observed by the Anglican Church up until today. So they've had 50 years of doing this. In the United Church, it stopped after the 1970s. And so in 1980, we have Alberta Billy, we have the Apology, we have all these movements that are happening at the same time that are bringing forward the issue of Indigenous presence in Canada and what we are doing about some of that relationship. In 1981, Alberta Billy stood before the leaders of the United Church and asked them to apologize to the Native peoples for what you did to them in residential school. the apology that was given in 1986. There was a response that came from Mrs. Edith Memnook from the Saddle Lake First Nation in 1988 that said the 1986 apology was accepted, but not, was acknowledged, but not accepted was the term. And I had that mixed up. With the expectation that the church would try to walk a more faithful path. We pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. And so this brings us to where we are today, whether these words of action are meant in a sincere way, and whether we are actually doing our work of reconciliation to our neighboring communities, or whether we are doing things that cause an affront or take old adages and complicate the relationship because of perceived indiscretions or a fear of not knowing, and whether we are actually building those relationships out. So in Vine Deloria, who is a theologian and a lawyer from the Lakota in South Dakota, he wrote in We Talk, You Listen that there are, and John has pointed this out numerous times, there's a linear Western way of thinking and a holistic way that Indigenous people think. And this holistic way takes in a lot of repercussions and understandings. It takes a lot of traditions and oral history and a lot of knowledge into things that have gone before and how those affect how we are today. And when the two meet at that star, that's where we actually have a point of dialogue. That's where we actually have a time to broach the subject. So when we think about Kamloops and the 215 children that were found in a mass grave, it becomes a flashpoint within this dialogue to try to build a better way of being or understanding our relationship today and what it will look like for the future, especially for those future generations that are coming up. One of the things we talked about at the Vancouver School of Theology at a conference that I gave a paper was the instances of young people who were very angry and wanting to deal with some of the issues and being put aside or ignored by either those in positions of leadership, those in government, those in other institutions that were not listening. And so what does that do for the future of our communities if we're not actually in dialogue? That becomes one of the touchy points of this presentation, our understanding of how we are together. So the residential schools, we had over 150,000 students involved. The foster care system, we have over 500 or 500,000, probably larger number of kids involved today. And then we continue to have the issues of missing and murdered women, as we're talking about today as the International Day for Women. We still live with a ongoing genocidal effect happening to many of the women in our communities and many of those who go missing or those who are vulnerable because of the way in which women are portrayed or understood in our communities, sometimes viewed as having less rights or less importance. And it is really these voices, I'm hoping that you're hearing that it's these voices of women who are bringing forward that challenge to the church and to the communities and bringing that information out. And so as an Indigenous man, it is my job to lift up and to understand where they are taking us and what their leadership and guidance is doing, and in a position where I'm able to amplify that voice and that understanding. So all of the work that we've been doing around missing and murdered women here and in the children, and it's really getting out to the communities. And here at the top, we have at a powwow, we took a bunch of effects for a parenting TV. So a lot of diapers, a lot of formula, a lot of things that people could, changing tables, changing stations and stuff where they could come and be a family and have the space to kind of do that and have their kids running around, have their kids playing, and have a safe space for them. And that is something newer to our community practices here. A number of different times that we have been out in the community and working toward change. With the residential schools, and here we see the McDougall Church in Morley and the reconstructed church, and what that does as a flashpoint to our community, that it's still there and that there is still hard feelings and misunderstanding and a continual need to work intergenerationally to build a better profile for the community, for the church, for the work of the church, and what we are trying to do in terms of reconciliation. So currently, we're doing a lot of work for the 40 days of reconciliation, as I was saying. We're doing 7, now it's 8 blanket exercises at different churches within the region, and using those as nodes to do outreach for the groups that are involved in the local area, so that they can start to build networks rather than trying to do the work alone. We're also doing reconciliation circles to talk about some of these happenings and things that are going on, especially around the Port Alberni School and other effects that are implicated in our area in southern Alberta. And now we're gearing up to have a feast on April 6th, which is Monday, Thursday, and that coincides with the traditional feast that we have on the reserve on the Good Friday. What we would do normally in our community and in our family, we would gather and have a turkey feast. We would fast before that and then have the feast at noon. And this would be on the ground with blankets put down. And this is a humble way of engaging with some of the Christian story and some of the story of our people in those traditions. And so it is with some of the churches in Calgary that we are starting to initiate this reconciliation feast for the community, and an opportunity for sharing a meal together, sharing time together, and starting to awaken to some of these larger issues that we are dealing with. So that's really all that I really wanted to share, but there's a number of other things that I can go into, but I think we should have some time for any questions. Let me know if you heard any of that, or if I just been talking to the blank screen the whole time.
No, thank you so much. Profound, huge. So much information, so much work you've been doing, so much work we've yet to do. But I invite people who have questions to put them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we're open.
Yeah, it's a safe space for people to ask. There are no, as John likes to say, there are no dumb questions. So.
I see Dave Moores.
Sure, a couple of hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Dave.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm still back on the national park piece. Sorry about the mountain that you don't have access to because it's in a national park. And I remember being with Aboriginal people in Australia a number of years back in a national park where they were allowed to take a kangaroo and roast and live on the land in whatever way. And it just seemed like I asked them about permission because, you know, that's what I thought you had to do in Canada. And they just said, it's our land and we do what we want. So I was interested to know what kind of movement forward, or what kind of megaphone
Sure.
settler churches could be. I just think that's ridiculous that you know,
it's sort of a double-sided sword. That's so there was an MOU signed. So this is the place just outside of the reserve is where this mountain is, and it's kind of a provincial park area. On the other side of that, on the other side of the mountain, there's at Banff, there was the attempt to draw in because of the centennial that was coming up in 2000, I believe it was 2013 of the Banff Park. And they wanted to have a better face of the relationship. So they signed an MOU with the Stoney First Nation. And in doing that, they negotiated between access for people, so we get a pass, and then we can go in and gather our medicinal plants and herbs and things in those areas. But it's regulated by that relationship, and they were the first in Canada to do that. So there hasn't been sort of this mass movement, and you've heard, especially in Alberta, with the Kenney government, they were starting to charge for access to particular parts of the Crown lands, and to privatize in some way. And so when you think about it, if they're privatizing areas which are primarily created to keep the Indigenous people off, so you're dealing with a lot of contested lands. You're dealing with a lot of issues that are sort of counter to provincial jurisdiction, and those that within the Banff Park and those other areas are federal jurisdiction. So trying to work in ways, especially with governments that are amenable to that relationship building versus others that may not be. So there's all kinds of complication around it. And so where the church sits within that, we have not really gone to the church to advocate for some of these holy places, because number one, a lot of them are already adulterated by tourism and different things, and amplifying that would only create more market for them. I think would create more of an abomination about what's happening there. When I went, I was traveling to Rome to take part in a conference in July. When I went there, I saw all of these sort of sacred sites, and there was kind of it reminded me of my father's quote about the money changers, and how these houses of worship are now very much sort of the places to make money. And in trying to cordon off or identify that to a public that is geared towards making money, it may only make it more problematic. And so if we wanted to go to Lake Minnewanka and declare it a holy site, we may see what happens at Lac St. Anne with the Catholic Church, and it's inundated at certain times of the year, big caravans going there to bathe in the waters, to do baptisms, to do other things. And I mean, it's kind of the devil you know versus the devil you don't kind of thing. And it's like, can we have at least an understanding of protecting areas and having a balance between what we insist on is progress and development versus the function of the land, and what the Indigenous people are saying about the sacredness of that land and the balance we have between the two, because we don't always think about the land in that way as an embodied spirit that needs its own ministry. And that's what Vine Deloria points out a lot.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks for
Thank you. Debbie has her hand up.
Thanks. Thank you, Tony, for, as always, a very informative and helpful presentation and teaching for me, for sure. Tony, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the reconciliation circles, just around the process, the structure. It's not easy to create a safe and or brave space for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to share space together. Can you speak a little bit about that, the support, the training, how you envision that unfolding? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. That is something that we are introducing into this time. One of the things that we started with was Ally Toolkit that I worked with the various churches and various groups on to bring in ideas around resources, what they were looking for, what was most valuable to them, and then start to build on that. Some process of training, which we're going to do, and we're going to do that for the Pacific Mountain area. So we'll try to get that introduction of the toolkit and what it means to your region, and how that could look if we change and adapt that into what is more suitable for as opposed to what we have a lot of Treaty 7 resources and things like that, moving into a different area and starting to develop in different ways. So there becomes sort of the foundation of where we're working from, so that everybody's sort of on the same page and that we can start to have a dialogue about where this sits within our particular communities and communication around our particular areas. So some of the one of the things that I found interesting was Reverend John Pentland at Hillhurst talking about how he had gone into Hillhurst at one point, and this was before he was the minister there, and how he'd gone to service there, and they locked the doors right after everybody got in, sat down, they locked the doors. And he was wondering, why did they do that? So he waited till afterwards and asked them, why was that done? And the story that they gave him was that, oh, we had a couple of Native people in here last week, and one of them broke a glass. So then they locked them out so that they couldn't come in and break glasses. And so that sort of way of being needs rehabilitation. And so it's taken a long time, especially around Hillhurst's affirming reputation and how they've developed that over the past 10 years to work toward being the first church in our area, in our city, to have a right relations person, to have a right relations position available, which I applied for and then started working with them for a number of years on that, and how that branched out into a more regional work around how we can do this together. Because it's impossible for one church to be able to do it by themselves, trying to build in a better practice by bringing together our level of understanding and education, and then start to look at where can we have the most impact, where can we facilitate reconciliation to communities in our area that will help achieve a longer balance, because reconciliation is not a one and done or easily over type of activity. It is an intergenerational activity, and we have to continue to work at it and continue to bring it up in order to find a better way of implementation for the future, so that it's not something that we leave behind, but it's something that is front of mind when we try to do our work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I see Heidi and then Marion.
Sure.
Hi, so thank you for that around the reconciliation circles. I'm really interested.
Earrings.
What was that? Oh,
like
my
your
earrings. Yes.
Very nice.
Seemed appropriate for International Women's Day. So a beautiful artist locally here made them for
Nice.
me.
Good.
So yeah. So I'm really interested in hearing about the reconciliation circles and how that plays out here, because my personal hesitation is around all of us white folks keeping to ask the local First Nations, come and teach us, come and teach us, come and be part of this. And there's so many of us that it's just overwhelming. It's too much. And so thank you for that. And the other thing that I have is around the Fairy Creek protests here, and just kind of the United Church's involvement in public protest when some of our values are in conflict, right? We want to affirm and back up First Nations in their decisions and their governance. And at the same time, you know, many of our folk are out there on the protest lines protesting, you know, against the death of trees. So, I mean, I've been kind of not saying very much about it because, you know, because I don't know what the right thing to say is, except that I mean, for me right now, leaning towards support of independent governance is the higher value for me, but that's not the case for everybody. So do you have any wisdom around that when those kinds of values come into conflict?
Yeah, and this has come into some of the work that was done in the Indigenous church around some of the pipeline and advocacy and other things that were activism that were happening around those times, and something that we've been contending with for quite a while. And I think that, as you say, and I think it's important to understand that we are stepping in as an institutional body, and that calling balls and strikes and lifting up certain people over others and taking sides is not a productive way of working with that community, but to be a moderating force, to be someone that helps to mediate, especially to government and to lobby government to find resolution and to remind that. I mean, we have the best bully pulpit every Sunday in front of all of these managers and CEOs, and we need to utilize that in a way that is, and not just the United Church, but others that have to start thinking in that way, that we are accountable to our communities and to the effects of that community, especially those that are put into precarious situations, danger, terrorist threat, or other things that we need to, and we've seen the repercussions of that with missing and murdered women. We've seen that with other issues where there's a downgrading or denigrating of a particular group, and how that we can see it even today with the drag shows and with the treatment of LGBTQ people, especially what we see in the States. And for those of us that are speaking out against that, speaking into a space of tolerance and understanding, and making sure that we are not giving a pass to some of the misinformation, oversights, and uneducated responses, but that we can have a balance in what we're doing. And I think that that's really important.
Thanks.
Thank you. Marion Best is next.
Thank you for your presentation, Tony. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
You mentioned the Indigenous Church in your timeline, and I'm wondering if you could tell us where we are in relation to the establishment of the Indigenous Church, the level of participation, the agenda, the staffing. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, for that specific, I think you'd have to go to Murray, and you have to go to some of the people within that, Sarah Stratton and others, because they have the hands-on experience. From what I've heard and from what I've seen from the decisions that were made from that, I think it was NIC01, and other proposals that were put forward at the last General Council, that those were adopted and accepted to try to form. And so all I know is that they've been working toward formation, and part of that work will hopefully come down to us in better form and understanding, and how we can participate in sharing that amongst each other, especially those that are working in this Indigenous role for the regions, and to try to bring that when we have more information. But I won't overstep that and start saying what I think. So, thank you.
Okay.
I can add one little piece to that.
Sure.
I know that there was an approval to send out a remit around voting toward an autonomous Indigenous church, and that remit is imminently prepared. It's supposed to be available by the mid to end of March for congregations, a study document, and then they have 1 year to vote on that remit to go back. They're hoping to deal with it a year from November, so November 2024, and they have the results from that remit. In the meantime, absolutely, they're working on it.
Yeah, it might be something we want to touch base when that time comes, so that people can have an orientation to what's being proposed and what the discussion is around that.
Excellent idea. Thank you. Natalia is next.
Thank you, Victoria. Hi, Rep. Tony. Thank you for your talk. I had the opportunity to see you on in Calgary in Okotoks with the Youth Council, and that was a really nice teaching too and talk. Now I wanted to ask you, I was hearing about the blanket exercise and about the reconciliation circle. Are those spaces open for children? I'm just speaking for children because I work for the First Term Ministry. So I would like to know if those spaces are open for them, and if not, if the Indigenous Church or your part is working or doing some spaces for children and youth, like specifically.
Yeah. So what I've done, we did the training, me, my brothers, a couple of my sisters, and a bunch of other people. There were about 60 people that were trained at the training that happened 2018 in Canmore, and got our facilitator certification. What they told us that at that point was to create our own Treaty 7 blanket exercise. And so we did that. and work through that with a number of different churches and groups. And this year, the Kairos stated, and I talked to the executive director, Aisha Francis, who said that they are no longer doing the blanket exercise. There was an extended cost to it, and there's other things that other ways in which it had become a tool for settler in education and in engagement, but did not even in the Kairos offices bring on the voices of the Indigenous people who were being critical of it or wanted to have different things added to it or understandings, and were continuously sort of sidelined from that. And so there's a lot of hard feelings around it. And so when this thing, when the blanket exercise was discontinued in the process from Kairos, they are not taking any more intake on that. So we have now, and what I'm doing is working with that blanket exercise that we developed, what we've learned as trained facilitators, and starting to work within the church to do these 7 blanket exercises and with other groups. So in that, I have done some alteration of that for youth and for children. So we did do at McDougall Church a family blanket exercise where we had very young kids and older kids and the parents and all coming together to take part, and had a feast afterwards. And so there's this ongoing way that I think that we don't, and what this is going to be interesting because we're now doing one with a Calgary Christian school, which will take in the K to 4, the 5 to 8, and then the 9 to 12. And doing separate blanket exercise formations for each group, and each sort of identifying in a different way. And so these are things that we are preparing in development and continuing to work through, but that can be one of your resources around that. But it is in dialogue with what you as a trained person within this area and working within the youth ministry, how that looks to you and how that you can then sort of adapt to your understanding of the, because you don't want to just have like a cookie cutter, you have to do this and sort of have the repercussions of that. And also to think through, we have some trauma-informed specialists within what we're doing to be able to say, okay, well, do it this way, not this way, and kind of understanding where the blanket exercise has been, because a lot of people remember things like having the baby taken away from them, and that's to have an Indigenous mother see that and have to experience that, so that a non-Indigenous person can feel that, can understand that, is troubling, because as we keep saying, believe the victims, believe these groups that are presenting this information, so that we are not constantly questioning them and the veracity of their claims. And because now that we've had the Kamloops Indian Residential School, we've had Port Alberni, these are facts. These are things that are happening in and amongst our communities, and they should not be sidelined or shirked over because of some of the ways in which we are constructing education. So in Alberta, it's a huge issue of the Indigenous curriculum because of the form of government. It's not in other provinces, but maybe it should be, because that is something that is contentious, that needs that Indigenous involvement and perspective of trained people who are looking at it in a, I think, a humane way of delivering some of that information. We're at 2:54.
We are. We're pretty close. We've got maybe one more question if somebody has one. Otherwise, we'll shift. All right. I see Lorraine Powell has her hand up. Lorraine Powell McKenzie. I can't read the last word.
Myself. So this has been very interesting. I'm part of a Truth and Reconciliation group in Enderby with the Splatcheen Band, and a number of them. It was started by them, and a social worker used to work with them, and I worked there as well before I went into ministry. And So we've been sort of just studying the history of the whole residential school and reading government things. And I'm reading Stolen from Our Embrace. Probably all of you have read that already. And so now this weekend we're meeting and saying, so how do we go from there? We meet at St. Andrew's United Church in Enderby, but we're hosting it. We didn't plan it. The Indigenous people asked if they could meet at our church. And I have done the blanket exercise years and years ago, but I haven't done it for a while. And I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations. So how do we go further? We have a group of people. Some of them are teachers, some of them are social workers, whatever. And a lot of people want to join. And we're thinking, so how do we start a new circle? And I don't know, I'm just wandering around where to go from there. And it's not necessarily, it wasn't started by the United Church, but because I used to work for the Splatcheen Band, they've invited me to be a part of that. And anyhow, looking for some wisdom.
Mhm. I think one of the interesting things that I sort of reflect back on is some of the work of racial reconciliation in the U.S. And there's a theologian called named Dr. Reverend Christina Cleveland, and she does a lot of work in different areas. She has a couple of books out, and she gave lectures, a number of different areas, had complications with her dealings with Duke University and racism, and Duke Divinity School and racism. And but one of the really important talks that I heard was she was working with a group of evangelical women. They had come up to her after one of her talks, and they asked for some info or some perspective on kind of the question that you're asking about, what do we do? And they've tried numerous times to have different things going on, and no one came to it. And so she said, well, have you talked with them? Have you worked with them? Have you kind of had this discussion with them? And in that situation, there was a lot of people with a Latino background who couldn't speak English and were newly immigrated to the US. And so they had to sort of find a way to have dialogue with them. They figured out that they could only meet at 11 p.m. as opposed to 11 a.m. And then they started to have discussions with them, and they would need sort of translators to come in. They were getting to the point that a couple of them started taking Spanish classes so they could understand. And then when they started hearing from them, they started hearing all these stories about healthcare, about people being incarcerated and other issues that were coming up, issues of family and different immigration issues and other things. And so they started to seek how they could help with that. And so they started talking to governments. They started working on different parts of this and with immigration and other things, and trying to help with the families, especially around healthcare and accessing hospitals and hospital care. And every time they ran up against an issue, they barreled right through it. They didn't let it stop them. They didn't let it sideline what they were trying to. They didn't give up. And to continue to speak to the people they were trying to help and the people that they were working with, and letting them guide them through some of this is critical in trying to establish a path of reconciliation, where we're not telling someone how to reconcile. We're not telling someone what to do, but that we are engaged with the heart, we are engaged with the mind, and what we are able to do, our background. If you're a teacher, if you're a nurse, if you're some other background, that there are important tools that are at hand that are not readily available to these groups that are struggling, and how we can bring a balance with the knowledge that we have, with the gifts that we have, to help and support. And I think it's exactly kind of what you're doing with the groups that are coming in. It's important that they get engaged in that way, that it is embodied work, and it is something that is negotiated and directed by this interaction and engagement and fulfillment of relationship, rather than saying, well, what do you need today, and then check it off and then kind of move on to the next thing. And it is this way of having concern, being the good Samaritan, and being in like-mindedness to say, okay, well, I've seen this happen, and I know this could happen to me. I know this could happen to my loved ones. I want what we've done with the Ukrainian population that have come to Canada, help and support. And yet there are many who look the other way for particular reasons. There was a person who's now involved with the Sandy Soda Spiritual Center, but she was for a long time at Brandon United Church in Brandon. And she had struggled for years to try to pull together enough money to do a circle and a little dinner with people and stuff. And yet there was the Syrian issue that came in, and suddenly they had $35,000. And so she had been struggling to get 700. And so where our priorities are, how we look at reconciliation, how we look at developing with the tools that we have, and where this community, where this mission wants to go. So that's, it can only come from that dialogue and working together. I know that in Calgary, there's a church that's fairly well off, and they offer their bottom basement space to a group to do a drumming circle. And they're for a long time disconnected from that. So what I told the person who was asking was that he should go and take part and see what's happening now, because they were leaving things all dirty and whatever, and not cleaning up after themselves. So rather than just complain to them and say that, go there, be there, watch what's going on, get involved. They wanted them to do a drumming portion for Christmas, and yet they had never talked to them. They had never worked with them. And so getting that ask is a monumentous thing when you don't have that relationship being built. Anyway, it's 3:01.
It is. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here and sharing your leadership and your guidance and your wisdom with us today. We truly appreciate it, and I look forward to working with you.
Anybody wants to ask more questions, or you want to send me an email, that's fine. I'll try to get to it as I can, but I'm very willing to sort of work with the various groups as John had been doing, and trying to continue that, being a resource to the people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will ask, would you like to offer a prayer in closing?
Sure. Creator God, we give thanks for this gathering of people, this circle of understanding, and we hope for enlightenment. We hope for a better path through this complicated territory. We know that we have a gift in your love for us and our love for one another, that we can begin something good for the communities here and those around us, to show an example in our cities, in our towns, and in our areas, that we might know how to be good neighbors again, and learn to develop that, not just at this time, but for the times that we go forward, and the times that we will need to rely on one another. Jesus Christ, Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.